can address us via EMPC to EMPC, but due to certain compulsions, sir has had to be in Kolkata. So still, it is our great pleasure that you have accepted our invitation to address on topic Bangladesh atrocities against the Hindu community. So we have Sri Swapan Das Gupta ji over here, and I would request Satish ji, Professor Satish Kumar from Discipline of Political Science, School of Social Sciences, give you to please introduce the speaker for today.
Thank you, ma'am. It is my privilege to introduce Mr. Swapan Das Gupta. Is the most prominent face, intellectual face of India, and the eminent scholar and journalist for the last 4 decades. He did his MA and BA from Stephens College, and MA and PhD from Oriental African Studies, London, and he also received the INLAC's fellowship in 1979. He accorded by the Stephens College, the most prominent journalist, alumni of the Stephens College, nominated to Rajya Sabha in 2016, and due to certain political reasons, he resigned in 2021 and was busy in politics in West Bengal. His books, there are many books and columns which he writes regularly. I am a vivid reader of his writings, but one of the books which was highly debated is Awakening Bharat Mata. So, sir, without taking much of your time, because hearing you is a pleasure. I was connected since 1991 when I was a student and contested elections in JNU, and you were the most prominent speaker quite often. Where across the party lines, people used to come and hear you out. Again, here, sir, on a very pertinent topic, all as faculty members and PhD scholars would like to hear you from what is happening in Bangladesh. Thank you, sir. Over to you. You are mute, sir. Sir, you are.
So you have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, I lost a little bit of the last few remarks of yours. But anyway, I presume that you're asking me to start. And firstly, let me apologize for not being physically present at IGNOU. I'd initially calculated that I would be in Delhi on that day. But, sometimes Bengal is a very unpredictable place and certain things happen and certain explosions are slightly periodic and sporadic, so which led me to be here this afternoon. But nevertheless, thanks to modern technology, I think we can very well have this meeting. Now, one of the biggest challenges I've often faced when talking about the entire experience of the minority community in Bangladesh, as well as the entire partition saga which preceded it, is to tell people that partition of India in 1947 actually happened in 2 parts. There was the western part, which is very well documented and publicized, and of which there's an array of literature which is there. And there is a less publicized partition of India which took place in the eastern part. Many of you may have been to the very wonderfully curated Partition Museum, which has been set up in Amritsar. You might find that one of the things is that the partition in the eastern part is sort of I wouldn't even use the word documented, is referred to as a casual afterthought. And I must confess, without naming names, that one of the curators there said, well, was it a very serious partition? Now, it's that misconception which is very much there. And one of the reasons why this partition in the East has not been taken that seriously was that whereas in the West, partition was accompanied by a veritable transfer of the minority population of West Punjab and Sindh, etc. In other words, the Hindus and Sikhs, and a few Christians, of course, of erstwhile Punjab, Sindh, Baluchistan, the frontier province, etc. There was a veritable transfer of that population to what is today's India. In the East, however, there was a shift in population, but it happened in dribs and drabs. For example, up to a lot of people have heard about the horrible riots which happened in Noakhali, where Gandhiji went there to try and pacify the population, to try and get things under control. People have also heard and have read the great Calcutta killings which began on 16th of August 1946, and which began the wave of communal recriminations which marred this thing. But at the same time, almost something like, I would say 28% of the population of what today constitutes Bangladesh and earlier constituted East Pakistan were Hindus and Buddhists mainly. The Buddhists were concentrated in a certain tract around Chittagong, and the rest of population was Hindus. These included two very major Hindu majority districts, which went over to Pakistan because certain Muslim majority districts up north, namely Murshidabad, had to be accommodated there to allow the contiguity, to allow the access into North Bengal. Nevertheless, whatever happened, that when partition took place, and because of the wave of the fear of whatever happened then, there was initially about 24 to 25 lakh Hindus and not so much Buddhists, Hindus, who moved from East Pakistan to India, mainly Assam and West Bengal. One of the biggest challenges the national leadership at that time faced was that there was insufficient resources in India to cope with the massive refugee crisis, in the West, that is in northern India, and at the same time cope with one of them in the East. At that time, the East received relatively less attention because of a particular theory which did the rounds. And the theory can be classified into two. One was a geostrategic one, which meant that the absurdity of a geographically separated Pakistan would not endure, and it was only a matter of time before East Pakistan actually merged back into India. In other words, there was no need to have a permanent approach to the refugee crisis there. The second thing which again flowed from this was the belief that the refugees would somehow, that it was not very serious in the East, the refugees would sooner or later get back and reclaim their lost houses, etc. in East Pakistan. Nothing of that sort happened. And in 1949-50, coinciding with the Indian accession of Hyderabad. And this is very interesting because all along the history we find that most of the exodus of the minorities from East Pakistan, Bangladesh, has in the main also been triggered by events which had nothing to do with them. So in 1950, when Indian 49, when Indian forces moved into Hyderabad, there was a reaction in East Pakistan which resulted in a lot of people getting uprooted. And when I say uprooted, it's got to be remembered that almost every single town and city in East Pakistan at the time in 1947 was Hindu majority. Dhaka was 80% Hindu. Chittagong was something like 70% Hindu. Rajshahi, Khulna, every single one of them were. So the ouster of the Hindu population from the east was also very much to begin with an urban exodus. It was a rural exodus insofar as most of the biggest landlords were also Hindus and they came over, but those people all invariably had houses and establishments in Calcutta, so that there was not very much by way of discomfort they had. There was a emotional wrenching, but apart from that, it was not that they were forced onto the railway platforms, etc., which the other refugees were. The other point why we find that this East Pakistan, the refugee issue in East Pakistan was never given the type of prominence in India, had to do with the internal politics of India. The refugee movement, and there was something called a refugee movement in the sense of people agitating for more land, agitating for rehabilitation, was in the main taken over by the communists by the 1950s. And one of the features of the communist movement, and you must remember that the communist movement had a very ambivalent attitude towards the establishment of Pakistan. They were for it, but they didn't want to support it too much. Most of the initial leadership of the Communist Party in Bengal were from East Bengal. They stayed over there for a little while, but then being Hindus, they were also turfed out. So there was that. And you'll find that a lot of literature around the theme of dispossession from East Pakistan was generated, but they were all had to do with the condition in the refugee camps. If any of you are familiar with the films of a very celebrated leftist filmmaker in Bengal called Ritik Ghatak, you might find that it's all about the struggle of the refugees in the camps. How terrible it is in the camps. But it's the question of what preceded the camps and why they were in the camps. That question was put into a state of denial in all of West Bengal. And even now, you find that there is a wariness, an unwillingness to actually address this issue. So there is that. But to come back to the main narrative, the exodus of Hindus has followed a certain pattern. Now, if the Hindus and Buddhists were 28% of East Pakistan in 1941, the 1941 census is a bit, as we all know, is a bit dicey, but it's a sort of approximate figure. There are some figures which suggest that they could be 30% as well. However, by the time the 1974 census in Bangladesh took place, this had gone down to 13.5%. Now, between that time in 48 and 1974, there was obviously the biggest turbulence which took place there was the establishment of Bangladesh and its secession from East Pakistan. Now, all of us who grew up in that during those very choppy times would remember the whole saga about how India hosted about 3 million refugees, and that became a big talking point all over. What is not mentioned, and which India, for diplomatic reasons, tried to actually put a lid on at that particular time, was the fact that 80% of the 3 million refugees who came into India from Bangladesh were actually Hindus. So the Pakistan army, while conducting a systematic assault on the Awami Leaguers, which they certainly did, and a lot of the Awami Leaguers got killed, and some of them were turfed out, and the entire political leadership of the Awami League was in India. But apart from that, there was a sustained ethnic cleansing as much as possible of the Hindus in Bangladesh. And what is equally interesting to note is that something like about 30 to 40% of those Hindus who came over at that particular point in 1971 didn't go back. They stayed behind because they feared for their. That is because in that preceding 40, 50 years, there had been systematic targeting of Hindus for different reasons. I gave you the example of how the accession of Hyderabad into India triggered a wave of attacks on Hindus. There was subsequently in 1965, when that famous incident over the Hazratbal in Srinagar took place, there was another sustained attack on Hindus. And while the other point which I must recall is that very little of these were publicized in any way. There have been documentation which is subsequently done about what exactly happened, etc., how many massacres took place. For instance, there was a very famous massacre in 1950 of a train which was parked on the bridge over the river Meghna, and the Hindus were systematically butchered in that train, and just their bodies were thrown into the river. So horrific events like this happened. But more than anything else, the pattern which normally took place was that in villages, what would happen was that, for instance, most people bathed in ponds. That included the women. So what would happen was that when the women went, and the women normally in a smaller village, normally went to bathe together at a particular given time. At that time, the pond would be surrounded by people who would be shouting hostile slogans, passing lewd comments, threatening them that they would be abducted, etc. In other words, what would happen was that the social environment of a place became so difficult that place people thought it's best to go. And some of them said, okay, let's go for a little while, if they had property. And we'll be back again as soon as the situation improves. But the situation didn't improve, and the enemy property regime resulted in the immediate confiscation of their property. So that the incentive to return didn't take place. Now, in India, there was also a slightly curious attitude towards it. Well, I'll give you an anecdote about it. In 1948, there was a Congress session in Jaipur, AICC session, the annual AICC sessions, which used to happen in those days. A delegation of refugees from East Pakistan went to the then Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and to press their case for adequate rehabilitation and certain facilities which they wanted. Nehru said, "You've come to the wrong place. Please go to the foreign department of the AICC." Now, that's very revealing. It's very revealing insofar as was somewhere thought that these people aren't really part of us. And that estrangement was a very major factor in that in this whole thing. Now, the other issue which was there was the Nehru-Liaquat Pact of 1950. Now, that was negotiated. I can understand why it was negotiated, because both the countries wanted a respite, because neither of them could cope with the refugee crisis any longer in both parts. So they wanted a respite, whereby both countries assured each other that the minorities in each other's places would be treated with dignity and respect. The point is, and that led to the famous resignation of Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee and all the Bengal ministers from the cabinet at that time, because they said it's a spurious thing. They will never honor this thing, and we will not be, and the Hindus of East Pakistan will be rendered absolutely orphaned without any political help or patronage, etc. And this is precisely what happened, because by then there were no minorities in West Pakistan, only the minorities were there in the East. And that was another factor which thing. And the Congress in West Bengal also maintained a certain studied ambivalence towards these people coming in from the East. One of the reasons for it was because most of these refugees had by then become the electoral fodder for the communist parties because of the takeover of the movement by the. So there was, so they lacked any sense of patronage. They were the people who were in the forefront of protesting, and the tradition, the militant tradition of East Bengal. Now, if any of you go to the cellular jail in the Andaman Islands, you might find that these are these boards which commemorate who was prisoners, etc. You'll find that a disproportionate number, something like 70%, were from Bengal. And of that 70%, something like 50% were from Eastern Bengal, which is East Pakistan. So the East Pakistan Hindus had this tradition of being the most militant, etc. And that became a bit awkward in the political climate of that time. Now, the larger question, which was there now, what do the there was an implicit understanding of everybody at that point that any of the Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs or Christians or anybody who came over from what constituted Pakistan, once they came over to India, if they sought refuge, they would automatically get citizenship. And this never posed a real problem till the Assam agitation of the 1980s. That was the first time that became, it was sort of red flagged for the first time. And there were various good reasons for it, why it was very red flagged in Assam. And partly because it became the excuse for almost an entire migration of Muslim migrants for economic reasons to come in and take over at least 2 or 3 districts like Barpeta, Dhubri, etc. So we have, by the time the independent Bangladesh is set up in 1971-72, a situation where there's a sort of uneasy truce between those who of a significant section of minorities in Bangladesh, which are there, about 13-14% still there, and then not being particularly welcomed in this part of the country because the facilities for it, because it was always a case of relief. Rehabilitation, which was a central part of how the refugees were treated in where refugees from West Pakistan were treated. I mean, all over Delhi, you have these colonies, which were basically colonies which were set up for the rehabilitation of them. And thanks to the rising real estate value of these people who got in with a small patch of land have done rather well as a result of it. Now, in Bengal, there was no such thing. There was sort of forcible occupation of vacant land which took place. Illegal, completely illegal. Because the idea there was that you would give relief but not rehabilitation, because this was not a permanent problem. So that issue was still very much hanging in the thing. Now, once the euphoria around the liberation of Bangladesh lasted very briefly. In 1975, 15th August, Mujibur Rahman and his entire family were assassinated, if people remember. And that was not only an assassination of Mujib, it was almost a veritable counter-revolution in Bangladesh. And what was surprising was that it happened without any murmur of protest. And that's something we'll find constantly in Bangladesh. Dramatic regime changes which take place without any people sort of acquiesce somewhere. Without any murmur of protest. There did come some sort of attempted thing, but that never took off. So from there, between August 1975 till about November 1975, there was a bit of a tussle between various fragments of the Bangladesh establishment. The pro-Pakistan elements tried to also get back into the whole game, and some other elements in Bangladesh which owed their allegiance to Ziaur Rahman did that. And at that time, a schism was formed in Bangladesh between two waves of the liberation struggle. If any of you go to Bangladesh today, you will find two types of greetings, like we say Jai Hind. There, the old slogan which Mujib popularized was Joy Bangla. But with the advent of another form of Bangladeshi nationalism, under General Ziaur Rahman, that became Bangladesh Zindabad. So when you hear someone say Bangladesh Zindabad, as opposed to Joy Bangla, or if someone say Joy Bangla, as opposed, you can more or less gauge their political identity very easily. And that's it's that schism which thing. But the point is that under Ziaur Rahman and subsequently under Ershad, what happened was that Bangladesh declared itself an Islamic Republic. That shift again resulted in a big exodus of harassment of Hindus from Bangladesh. And this time also, what was very noticeable was that it was you see, the exodus was always accompanied by distressed sales of property or confiscation of property. A very famous case is that of a gentleman called Dhirendranath Datta, who was a Congress member of the old Legislative Assembly. He was the first person who went to the Pakistan National Assembly in 1948 and said Bengali should also be recognized as the national language of Pakistan. So in the sort of history of the language movement in Bangladesh, he occupies a very central role. Now, in 1971, he was by then about 80, 85, even more perhaps. The Pakistan army got hold of him, took him to the cantonment, tortured him and killed him. His body was never recovered. Now, he was a prosperous gentleman in Kumilla. After the liberation, his entire properties were taken over by the state. Why? Because he said, well, you haven't been able to produce a death certificate. There was no body. So we can only assume he'd fled the country and gone over to India. So you can see that if it can happen to someone as iconic as that man, what will happen to lesser people whose properties? And at every point, the properties were taken away, and there was no sort of compensatory features about it. Compensation was very rarely given. So in 1992, after the demolition in Ayodhya, there was another big wave, and that was a huge wave, which resulted, and I think here we've got the figures, which resulted in about 28,000 documented cases of attacks on minorities. These included 9,500 houses, which were completely demolished, 2,700 commercial establishments of Hindus, which were also vandalized, and some 3,000 temples, which were destroyed. And these included the very famous Dhakeshwari temple, I think, which has been demolished and rebuilt for 4 times by now, since independence. It's the most famous one in Dhaka. So another exodus. What happens to the exodus? Were they recognized as such? No. People just came over because of insecurity. And when the insecurity, I'm telling you, I'll give you a very small example of the insecurity. Around 6 years ago, when I was in Dhaka, I went to the Dhakeshwari temple. I normally go there because it's a very useful place to meet the local Hindus. I mean, it just happens to be a congregation point. So a lot of people, once they hear you're from India, etc., and you can speak Bangla, so they come and, pour out whatever they have to say. So one of them, he said, well, I said, how's life? He said, well, I can't complain too much, but I have a sister. She's 21 years old. The only thing I can say is she hasn't been raped. Now, can you imagine? I mean, for someone to actually say that, that insecurity, that fear is very much there. This time, just shortly before the elections here, I'd again gone. And this time, those guys were saying, well, for the past 10 years, now, there were a lot of things which were a problem as far as the Hasina government is concerned. But one of the things which this person said was, we've had a little time to breathe. I mean, the translation is, we've had a little time to breathe. And immediately after the government was overthrown, you had, according to the Hindu Buddhist Christian Council of Bangladesh, some 208 or 220 attacks on Hindus. These included attacks on temples, etc. Last Durga Puja was a particularly bad time because, a lot of Hindu temples were attacked on the spurious plea that somebody had put out a pig or some nonsense, some absurd thing, which again turned out to be a social media fakery, which resulted in many things, particularly ISKCON temples being attacked. For some reason or the other, the ISKCON has emerged, and I'm just giving this as an anecdote, because you get very interesting footnotes out of it. The ISKCON has emerged as a defender, as the most militant defenders of the Hindus in Bangladesh. ISKCON, along with the old traditional Bharat Shivashram. People like Ramakrishna Mission and all might be respected, etc., but they're not seen as someone who stands up for the community. This is just, by the way, a footnote. Now, the difference this time in these attacks, were twofold. One, India made it very clear that they would not take it lying down. This had never happened before. All the attacks on Hindus in the past in Bangladesh had met with Indian concern, but nothing else. No one as high as the Prime Minister. I mean, you probably got the local High Commissioner to come and give a protest note. That it more or less ended at that. But for a Prime Minister to actually use the Red Fort address to talk about this was something unique, and that shook Bangladesh. There were a lot of people who were incensed, and they said they should redouble their attacks on Hindus. But anyway, it served a purpose for the moment that it stopped that. Secondly, something also very, very interesting happened. For the first time in living memory, we actually had large 1 lakh plus Hindu demonstrations in places like Dhaka, Chittagong, Sylhet, Khulna, etc. So the Hindus saying, we will not take this. This is our land. Now, this, to my mind, is something which we need to ponder over as the last point, which I'll sort of mention about. For a long time, there's been a debate within India and even in Bangladesh, although in Bangladesh that debate has been more subdued, about what is the fate of the Hindu minority in Bangladesh. Is it, and I've also occasionally subscribed to this, is it the policy, should it be the policy of successive governments of India, regardless of political persuasion, to arrange for a gradual humanitarian exodus of the minorities from Bangladesh to this country? Or should the Hindus of Bangladesh, whose numbers actually have gone down to as low as 7.95 of the population, I mean, it's in percentage terms, it's falling with each census. Or should the Hindus of Bangladesh stay there, fight for it, fight for their rights, and emerge as citizens, try to influence the politics, the political dispensation, etc., of that country in the best way they can, with India giving them some sort of moral sustenance, but nothing more. These are the two particular perspectives which have emerged. I don't know which one will actually prevail, but there is a debate going on. I wouldn't say debate, but I would say these are concerns which get articulated over time. And the debate over the CAA actually forced the issue of the Hindus of Bangladesh onto the political map of India. It hadn't been there on the map. So the climate within India has also changed as far as the concern of Bangladeshis are concerned. But it's a very precarious existence which the Hindus of Bangladesh face, because it's not so much in the big towns. It's not in Chittagong or in Dhaka or those places where the problem arises. The problem arises in these small towns, in these villages where there are isolated families, etc., and the growth of a form of Islamic radicalism in a sort of international sort of way, which has obviously had its footprints in Bangladesh, has made it worse. So these are not firm answers, but I just want to give you a perspective of what the situation as far as Bangladesh is concerned. Thank you very much. I think Satish, you wanted some questions, etc.
Now the house is open for further interaction. There are many teachers from history as well.
नमस्कार सर, मेरा प्रश्न है कि ये सही है कि लोकतांत्रिक सोसाइटी में आर्म्ड रेसिस्टेंस को बहुत वैलिड नहीं माना जाता, लेकिन जहां जहां इस ढंग की एट्रोसिटीज होती है वहां ये एक स्वाभाविक प्रक्रिया के रूप में भी उभरती है। तो बांग्लादेश में जो माइनॉरिटी हिंदूज थे, क्या आर्म्ड रेसिस्टेंस का कोई केस है बड़े पैमाने पे या नोटिसेबल पैमाने पे, या आप देखते हैं कि फ्यूचर में अगर ये एट्रोसिटीज इसी ढंग से चलती रही तो क्या कोई ऐसी आशंका है कि आर्म्ड रेसिस्टेंस हिंदूज की तरफ से बांग्लादेश में होगा?
It's a relevant question. The only place where there has been armed resistance has been in the Chittagong Hills tracts. जो चाकमा issues का जो कहते हैं ना, that was interesting because in 1947 initially वहाँ Indian झंडा फैला गया था, and later it became part of Pakistan. And Pakistan and it was an attempt by Bangladeshi Muslims to forcibly settle themselves into that part of Chittagong. So that resulted in armed resistance by what was called the Shanti Bahini. And it led to a peace talks. ये वो करके बहुत दिन चला. Bangladesh used to say that we are using the Shanti Bahini because they were attempting to foment insurgency in the northeast. And वो भी, लेकिन Bangladeshi Hindus are mainly concentrated and focused in small in towns. ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा. ढाका में है, but not in any particular area. एक दो जगह है. जो बहुत सा communities है जिसका the traditional occupant, for instance, the weavers. एक बड़ा community of weavers were there, Hindu weavers in Bangladesh. Most of them have now come over to this side. So we are producing actually better jamdani than them in West Bengal. And that's just a small afterthought. But I mean, the jamdani there is, of course, very good. There's no doubt about that. So logistically, any form of armed resistance is ruled out. What is possible is how much they can use, they exist as a political bloc. And that is what, but one of the things is there has been no real leader of the Bangladeshi or East Pakistan Hindus for a very long time. Discernible, identifiable leaders. Most of them are chota mota, a bit of operators here and there. During the elections, they come by, humko ticket dilwa do, those sort of things. Not very persuasive leaders you can get from there. So I don't really treat it. I think they've got, well, let's see what this new wave of militancy within the Bangladeshi Hindus, whether this results in the evolution of a leadership in Bangladesh and how the polity of Bangladesh evolves. Now, if you want my particular thing, I can foresee that there's going to be a three-way split in this new dispensation, with the students going one way. But the students are militant; they are anti liberation struggle legacy, but they're not necessarily anti-Hindu. I mean, there's all sorts of confusing signals which are emerging from them. As opposed to that, you have the BNP and Jamaat who don't want the Hindus around because they feel that those votes will go to always go against them. So these trends are there.
Thank you, sir, for your nice lecture. Here, Dr. Madan Yadav, Department of Political Science. Sir, what about the concern of the atrocities? We have really sympathy with the minorities of the Bangladesh. Sir, do you think this is at the state level, Bangladesh is going to be declared as the failed state? Second, do you think it is also failureness of the India's foreign policy? When this crisis started, Indian Prime Minister not ready to speak strongly as the American President. What happened concerned across the world?
See, the role of America, if you really look at it, the role of America in fomenting the change in Bangladesh has never been overt. It's been very covert. To directly blame America for that is very, very difficult. What Americans did was that they undermined the legitimacy of, systematically over the years, they undermined the legitimacy of the Hasina government. And the Hasina government did a lot of things which was certainly not worth talking about. I mean, they were very crude. They were authoritarian. they were dictatorial in their things. So all those, and the 3 elections which they conducted were all farcical. These are facts. We cannot deny. We cannot run away from this. Now, can we blame India for that? How much control? I know for a fact that our diplomats, our people, the agencies, etc., went to Hasina at various points and said, "Bhai, you must allow an opposition to be there. You can't suppress an entire opposition. Thoda to jagah dijiye unko." But in Bangladesh, traditions of democracy are not what they are in India. And it's to call it a failure of Indian foreign policy would assume that India was controlling everything which was happening in Bangladesh at that time. There's a lot of the students believe that is the case. A lot of the Bangladeshi elite people believe that is the case. But the reality was not that. So you can say, yes, it's a failure insofar as that in our neighborhood, we've got a hostile regime. That is, in that sense, it is a failure. Of course, it's a failure. But could we have done otherwise? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. I have one more question, sir. That series of massacre took place in Bangladesh since 1947 till today. It is still continuing. Despite being very gruesome murders which are taking place, it did not become a strong narrative in India. We are living in India, so we like to know from the Indian intellectuals. The issue of Kashmir became a narrative in India. The issues of Northeast became narratives in India. But the issue of Bangladesh atrocities against the Hindus, the minority, did not become a very strong narrative. What are they?
Yeah, it's certainly, one of the things is one of the complete domination of the left. Now, per se, I'm not saying that the left itself is anything, but the point is, one of the features of the left was that you underplay, if not outrightly deny, these particular massacres and don't focus attention on them. So the literature on the subject is very, very thin. The academic literature on the subject is almost non-existent. The academic literature. You have people like Joya Chatterjee, who has written about it. She almost virtually denies it. Then you had a lady called Sharmila Bose, who happens to be one of the grandnephews of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Her thing, Dead Reckoning, suggests that most of the claims of atrocities made against the Pakistani army in 1971 are false. So you have that sort of literature there. And the Bangladeshi intellectuals themselves have never focused on this embarrassing thing about the atrocities on Hindus which were committed right from 47 to date. That has not, they've sort of bypassed it. So unless more literature or more research is done on the subject by people, particularly academic literature is produced, you're likely to get this sort of a situation where it's going to be glossed over and not deemed to be respectable. The first time someone wrote a comprehensive work on the plight of the Hindus in Bangladesh from 47 to around 2010 was a gentleman called Tathagat Ray, who was a political man. Now, he's written a very good work, but it's not an academic work in that sense. I mean, none of you would recommend it to your students because I don't think they'll find an appropriate place in the footnotes. So you have that. And there is some stuff in Bangla. There is some stuff on Bangla, but as we well know that unless something is really written in English, you don't get onto the front bench of academic respectability.
You have a question? And then next. Please, sir. I want to ask about the role of international organizations. So,
You come and ask. It is audible. It is audible.
I can hear you. I can hear you, sir.
okay. Sir, in this current situation which is going on in Bangladesh, what is the role the international organizations are playing, or what the role they are not playing? What means what they are doing and what they are doing, and what is the rationale behind both of these things?
Yeah. Bangladesh has always been the most fertile ground for NGOs. It's the place where the NGOs mushroom, the NGOs have an economy of their own, and it's where business doesn't exist. NGOs actually think, but although these days business also exists, the government industry is thriving in Bangladesh. The role of the NGOs and all these sort of international organizations in undermining the legitimacy of the Hasina government was something I mentioned earlier in passing. That was a very important thing. Now, the NGO and that sector is absolutely elated. They are jubilant because they've got 4 people in the government. They've got Mohammed Yunus, who's nothing but NGO. They've got Rizwana, who's a Magsaysay award thing. They've got the former CEO of the Grameen Bank Foundation. And they've got another person whose name I forget. 4 people who in that thing. So the NGOs are now in the political structure, except they don't represent very much. And they want a fundamental overhaul of the entire system of Bangladesh. Whereas the political parties like the BNP and the Jamaat or any of the smaller parties say, we want elections in 6 months so that we can get to power. So those guys say, no, we need 5 years to repair Bangladesh. So there's that tussle. And of course, in between, there is the army, which ultimately decide which one will prevail. But my own feeling is, at present, it's the high noon, it's the honeymoon period for the NGOs in Bangladesh, but it's not likely to be very enduring. It's going to be very, very short-lived. I don't believe that the Yunus government will last for very long.
So there was a major portion of my questions about international organizations such as United Nations Security Council and others.
No, UNSC doesn't matter. It's never gone up to UNSC. No, the point is the UNSC, it's not there. But various other bodies of the UN, the UN has so many bodies, so many consultants, so many quangos. I mean, it's a parallel global economy of its own. So a lot of that is present in Bangladesh. Human rights agencies, climate change, flood control, सब कुछ है, वो तो चलेगा, तो they thrive. I mean, much more than they thrive in Delhi.
I think thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful session. And on behalf of myself and all the participants present over here and watching you through the YouTube channel, I thank you, and hopefully we will soon have you in person and in group. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I thank all the participants over here also for attending the session.